Well, hello, and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. Today, we're going to do some quick painting of these bad boys. Oh yeah! Here are my bros, the Armigers. I'm going to name them Tempe and Mesa. I got them when I was on a trip to Phoenix, so I thought that was an appropriate, and boys this big need a name, so there we are. These are fully magnetized, so I can swap the weapons out at will, and while you'd probably never field an Armiger with two of these cleavers, you have to admit that looks really freaking cool. Anyway, I gave these guys a zenithal prime. You can kind of see it's pretty dark under there, and up here it is pretty light. I went with skeleton bone from Army Painter as my zenithal. Well, the highlight anyway, the top part of the zenithal, because I did want to have kind of a warm, creamy tone to these models, as opposed to that very stark white. And as you can see, I added some decorations to the base. It's relatively simple, but it looks pretty decent. In case you're wondering, these are bits from the Kilty Mokteros box. There's some of the terrain I haven't built yet, and I thought it would make a really nice accent to this base. So, let's talk about the plan, shall we? The plan here is relatively straightforward. I'm going to try to apply speed painting techniques to these models, basically starting off with a Basecoat Glaze, and moving on to some washing, then doing some, I don't know if I'm going to do dry brushing. Well, I will do dry brushing, but not in the normal sense. For sure, the base coat for kind of the non-armored components is going to be a dark black, and I'm going to dry brush that with a very shiny silver, but with a kind of a highlight pattern, so kind of going down, so that, you know, stuff facing up gets a highlight, stuff facing down does not get a highlight. That's the idea. As for the base coat for the carapace and the armor plates, I'm going to go with a bright purple. I don't have anything that's purple, and I want something bright, and purple is the color I've adopted for this channel, so yeah, why not? And as for the accents for the secondary color, I'm going to go with a skeleton bone, much like this one. I feel like the combination of those two colors is pretty neat. And any details that I'll decide to add on, well, those will be fine. I'll choose whatever colors seem reasonable. But that's the plan. I expect that this shouldn't take too long, although these are pretty large models, and there's two of them, so it might take a little longer than I think. Let's get started with the Basecoat Glaze. So the very first step in the Basecoat Glaze process, well, is actually not Basecoat glazing. In fact, I used something different. I used this stuff, Gravelord Gray. It's speed paint from Army Painter. It does a lot of the same work that a glaze would use, but it's different. So they're not one-to-one. But I've used this in the past, and I really like the way it works. It's about the only speed paint that I'm comfortable with. The others, they work the same way, but the colors leave something to be desired. I don't know what that's about. Just me, personally, I don't like them as much. But this one, the Gravelord Gray, I used it on all the mechanicals, all the stuff that's underneath the armor plates. So all the machine stuff, basically. And it went on, and it went on okay, but it was a little light. It was a little lighter than I expected or remembered. So I don't know what I did before that made it look different, but it was a little light. And so I thought about using a second coat of it, but I was like, you know what, before I do that, let me test it out with my next usual step. So it worked, right? So I went in with some dark tone to wash, and it did darken it up enough that I think I'm going to keep it, but I'm not 100% there yet. But we'll talk about that in more detail when I get to the washing step. The next part of the model that I base coat glazed was the armor, all the carapace, like the stuff that goes on top of the mechanicals to protect the mechanicals. And for that, I used a purple that I'm a really huge fan of. Xeris Purple by Citadel Color. You'll notice that it's in my bottle that's not the flip-top lid. I finally got sick of those little flip-top lids. I love the paint inside. I don't know what it is, but it's so rich and saturated and beautiful. It's a beautiful purple. But I hate the flip-top lid. I hate having to scoop it out with the end of my brush. It was just such a thing. So I actually spent some time and rebottled the few Games Workshop actual paints that I have. So I've got 2 others. The rest are fine, like the washes I'm cool with, and I just don't have that many Citadel colored paints, but I really do like them. And I'm thinking about exploring this range a little bit more. Not that I'm unhappy with Army Painter, just this one, these look nicer, at least in the instances that I've used. At any rate, I did add, it was base coat glaze. It was a medium to light bodied glaze, so still a lot of the undercoat showing through the model. Here is my progress so far with my Armigers base coat glaze. It's not all the way. You'll notice that there's still a lot of the trim, some of the details down here. They don't have a base coat glaze. The bases don't have a base coat glaze. That's fine, because I'm not quite finished with it, because I'm not sure I'm digging this. Like, I love the color purple. I love the way it looks. I'm not so sure I like the trim being this bone white, or skeleton bone. So I think I want to change that. I think I want to go back in here and make these kind of a metallic color, like a really nice bright metallic. I've seen some really nice work with people showing off like a very shiny metal thing, and I think that's what I'm going to end up doing with this model. However, I still want the purple to be represented here. I don't want it monochromatic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, and on these parts of the armor that have kind of a split thing, I'm going to paint half of it one color and leave the other color purple, and the other color I'm going to use the skeleton bone. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to add some skeleton bone to like this panel right here, to half of the leg armor. I'm not sure about this yet. Maybe I'll add some striping. I don't know. But I'm going to add the skeleton bone more deliberately, and I'm going to then go in and base coat these this trim that's going to be metallic. I'm going to base coat it in a very dark black. I think a pure matte black will work, so that when I go over it with a metallic color, it'll be nice and shiny. I'm not quite done with the base coat glaze for these models, but I did want to point out one thing as I'm working on this. So you'll notice the difference between these 2 models. The silver on this model is very different from the silver on this model, at least on this really big piece. Well, really big, right? And so the difference is that this one has 2 coats, but more importantly, I have a normal base coat glaze that looks like this, and you can kind of see how patchy it is. And that's the way it's going to look, if we have a metallic silver over a black undercoat with just a single coat. What I'd like to do is to go ahead and add a second coat, but the second coat is going to be thinner. It's going to be more diluted than the first coat. So here I have a medium-bodied glaze, and then here I go with a kind of a light glaze as a second coat. And as you can see, it removes that patchiness that is very evident here. Now, you could do that with other parts. Like you see the kind of the patchiness here with the purple, but I'm not doing it here because I want to stick to the kind of the base coat glaze. Once you start adding layers to the base coat glaze, it kind of stops being a base coat glaze and just becomes a base coat, which is fine. But I want some of the kind of the variations to follow through, and I also want the next coat, the next step, the washing to kind of show up and darken the color a bit. So before I do any second coats, I want to see what it looks like with the wash. But for large areas like this, especially for metallics, it might not be a bad idea to go ahead and add that second coat to make the metallic look more consistent. Oh my God, the base coat glaze took forever. But here it is. That's what the base coat glaze looks like on this model. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but you know what? I'm gonna reserve my judgment until after this next phase, which is going to be the washing phase. So I do want to point out that I went ahead and added a second coat of just about everything. The zenithal highlight was basically gone, so it's fine. It was always going to be gone anyway. Really, you can only really see the zenithal highlights if you use like inks or speed paints or contrast paints, stuff like that. Sometimes I can kind of see it, but it really ends up with a kind of a dull color. So yeah, that's what it looks like. You'll notice I have the base kind of painted, also just kind of base coated. I fought so hard with the orange. In fact, these plasma or these melta kind of ammo things were supposed to be orange, but I'm using Army Painter, and I know Army Painter's orange aren't very good, but I wanted to give it another decent shot, and it wasn't any better. So I hit them again with a little bit of pure red. So they look like that. All right, that's what it looks like with the weapons on. I think it looks all right. But yeah, there's just so much surface area to this model. And also there's two of them. So base coat glazing, or I'm guessing just the base coat by itself, it's going to take you a while, and if you have to go back and do a second coat, it's going to take an even longer while. So these are all things to keep in mind. I'm doing this without the aid of an airbrush because I don't have an airbrush and I live in an apartment, so I can't have an airbrush. I don't have a workspace. I literally work on my kitchen counter. So no airbrush for me, but if I can pull this off, it's clear that if you don't have an airbrush, you can do Imperial Knights, at least these small guys. All right, let's move on to the next step, which is washing. The washing step went a lot faster than the base coat glaze step. That's to be expected. Washing can be pretty quick, a little slower if you're really careful with it. I was pretty quick. I wasn't that careful with it. I wanted to do I wanted my washing to end up pretty dark, but I still wanted it not to be gloopy. So for most of the model, I went with Nuln Oil from Citadel Color. I use it for tasks that are generally delicate because it does a really nice job of getting into those little cracks and crevices and not darkening the kind of the surfaces of what I'm washing too much. Although for this, in this case, I did want extra darkness, so I gave it 2 coats. I could have just gone with Army Painter's dark tone, but I'm a little wary of using that now. It can be a little splotchy. You have to be a bit more careful with it, and so I wanted to make sure that this one looked pretty good. So I went with the Nuln Oil, and it looks pretty decent, I have to say. I only used 2 other colors for shading on this, and I wanted to point out that I normally shade the bone white or kind of like lighter colors with something like Agrax Earth Shade, but I didn't do that here because I wanted the darkness to be consistent. So, you know, having as it is, I have the bone white and the purple kind of close together, and so I thought it would look kind of weird to have Agrax Earthshade as my shadows for the bone white, and then the Nuln Oil for the darker stuff. So I just went with that one for almost the entire model. And I think it looks pretty good, and it's gonna really help, I think, the next step, because primarily I want to establish shadows. I want the purple and the bone white and the metal that's in shadow to look a bit darker than the stuff that's on the surface, right, where the light would strike. And here is one of my armigers. This has the Nuln Oil wash all over it, but I did went ahead and added a bit more, so some of it is just one coat, other parts of it is a double coat. Particularly I did this in areas that I was very sure were going to be in shadow, so parts of the pauldron kind of down here, anything that's underneath, that got a double coating of it, so I wanted to make sure it was nice and dark. So that when I go back and highlight the purple and the bone white, it has something to contrast with. That's the idea. I don't know how well the execution is going to go, but I'm going to give it my darndest. So little areas like this and that, those have extra shadow. And this armiger doesn't have any wash. So why don't you see the difference between the two of them? Kind of side by side. The wash does a nice job of getting into those crevices and making it look like a real model as opposed to just a toy that I've slapped some paint on. It drives up that contrast in delicate ways that I couldn't do manually, you know, with a brush. So I used a lot of Nuln Oil to do this, and I'm going to use even more to do this, but I think it's a worthwhile expense. It makes your models look very nice, and it really helps establish the shadows that your eventual highlights will contrast against. So, make sure you do that step. All right, let's talk dry brushing. That's my dog's leash. That's my studio. So yeah, for the dry brushing, I kept it pretty simple. I used Army Painter's gunmetal. It is the darkest of the silver metallics that I have, and I used this specific color or shade appropriate for metallics. I don't know. I used this hue of metallics because the stuff that I was going to dry brush is in shadow. And so this contrasts with the shiny silver that I used on the carapace, which is not in shadow. It's facing the light, or the light is striking it. And so I wanted that to be a brighter shade of silver. And so I used this stuff. I slapped it on my texture palette, which is quickly becoming unrecognizable and kind of gross, but it does a really nice job of helping me do a nice job with the dry brushing. I applied a very light dry brush of this stuff over all the mechanicals, so all the black parts that are under the carapace, just to kind of give this idea that it's black metal, but the sun is kind of diffusing and it's hitting certain parts of it, and whatever it's hitting is shining, but just a little bit. It's a nice subtle effect that can do a really nice job of picking out the details with all those mechanicals without having to go in by hand and hitting every one of those little conduits and ports and buttons. It's a quick and dirty trick, but it makes a huge difference. So while I'm talking about dry brushing, I do want to point out another couple of things. So I did the same kind of dry brush on the weapons. Any place there was going to be black, I wanted to look metallic, so kind of a casual shiny sheen on those parts. But the most important thing is that is something that I didn't do. And that's dry brushing the carapace. Now, normally in this step, I dry brush the colored parts of the model. So in this case, the purple and the skeleton bone colors on the carapace, I'd normally go in and do a dry brushing on each of those panels to essentially reestablish the original color, right? It would give me a nice, it would basically establish as the mid-tone, right? So I've got the Basecoat Glaze and I've got the wash over that to darken it to establish my shadows. I'd go back in there with the dry brush and establish the midtones. In this case, I decided not to do that. I mean, that was the original plan, but I want to do that in the next step, maybe another video, depending on how well it turns out, because it may not turn out, and if it's horrible, then I don't want to show you guys, because who wants to see that? But the whole point is that in this case, I did not go in and establish my shadows or even my highlights, which I normally would do with dry brushing, because I want to try glazing. I want to try another technique, maybe some blending, I don't know. I think this model is big enough that I can experiment with it, but it doesn't really have a place in this video because this video is all about getting your models done quick and easy, and I feel like those other steps are going to be a struggle, so if I do try that, I'll try that in another video. This one's just going to focus on quick, dirty, easy, and not bad looking. Yeah, that's the plan. There's one step left in my quick painting kind of scheme, and that's probably the hardest, although maybe in this model not so hard. It's the detailing phase. For the detailing phase, thankfully, I don't have a ton to do. This is a part of the project that usually takes the longest, but this is such a large model and is quite detailed, but detailed enough that I was able to take care of almost all of that with the dry brushing. The details that remain are relatively minor, things like the eyeballs on the face of the mech, is that the right word? The robot suit? The knight, the Armigers, right? They have eyeballs, some of them. The little voice box. Sometimes there's a little skull on the shoulder or the knee pad, so I made sure to kind of detail those. And on the actual body of the knight, on the back, there is like a seal, and that's a welcome splash of color on the back. The back is mostly black and silver, and so it's a nice way of introducing a splash of color into the model, so I made sure to paint those. Most of the effort in the detailing phase came from the weapons. There's quite a few of them, and each of those, they kind of have their own color scheme, right? So I went with a little accent of red for the melta weapons, a little accent of green for the auto cannons, right? The idea is that there's so much, it's bulk ammo, and so it's made at a random manufactorium, and so of course you've got army green. But I also made sure to introduce the color purple onto the weapons as another accent color. And so, there's a couple of buttons, a couple of fobs. There's those teeth on those chain, what was this? Chain glaive? No, the chain cleaver. There we go. The chain cleaver. And so I had to make sure to detail all of those. Basically just introduce enough of visual interest to kind of pick them out so they don't melt into the rest of the mech. So, spent a little time on this, but not as much as with other projects. And here are the two bad boys side by side. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way they turned out. Now, they're a little dirty looking, they're kind of scruffy, and that's probably fine, right? This could be as far as you take the model. Think of this though as the basic, right? So you've done all the steps, you've made it tabletop ready, and you've pushed it a little bit further, right? Because in this condition, they're pretty good. They're probably better looking than most of the people you play with, but they're not going to be among the best. If you wanted to push it a little further, you could do a bunch of other stuff to that, right? You could do some glazing, you could do some blending, you can do all kinds of things, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about getting it done without an airbrush, quickly, easily, and pretty good looking. Not pro level, just good enough to make it look good. And I think we've accomplished that here. So let me give you some thoughts about this project overall. Okay, thought number one. I'm really digging these bases. I know it's not the main part of the project, but in fact, I probably didn't even show you how I made them because it's usually an afterthought for me. But I managed to add two different textures to the base, along with some rocks and some terrain, things to decorate the thing. And these bases are really large for these models, so you want to not skimp on these, because if you don't try it a little bit hard, it's going to look kind of bad and it's going to make the rest of your model look not so great. But with a little bit of effort, you can make the base look pretty decent. So here I had mostly, my usual basing technique, which is, I glue down kind of the major elements. I go back in with some wood glue and pour it on different places, spread it around, add some different varieties of grit, and I usually stop there, but here I added a second layer. I added some of that texture paint. This isn't crackle medium, this is the usual Unreal on Earth. That's what I used for this. In fact, the color doesn't even matter. As long as it's the crackly version, then you can basically combine the two different textures on the single base. And if you do it right, it'll look pretty interesting, pretty neat. I've tried this before and it looked like garbage. It looks like I'm getting better at that. So yeah, that was the first takeaway. The second takeaway is that although I didn't use an airbrush, and an airbrush is not at all necessary, it could probably help. This took a long time. In fact, base coating, whether you use a glaze or a normal base coat, especially if you're going to use several coats, 2 or more, it's going to take you a while. There's just a lot to this model. There's just a lot of surface area, and you want to do the job right. So it's going to take a bit. Took me like a week and a half. Now, obviously, I'm not doing this full time. I do it like an hour at a time, something like that. So it takes me a while, but this was probably the project that took me the longest in terms of just base coating. The detailing didn't take me that long because, thankfully, the details are... There are not a lot of details that it singled out. Most of the details that you see, like inside the mechanicals and the legs, that was done by drybrushing. I didn't have to do any kind of precise thing, pick out a certain whatever. It was drybrushing. That was pretty easy. The only other details that were left are like the eyeballs, some stuff with the weapons. You'll notice some stuff here with the weapons. And then this thing back here, which I thought was kind of neat. Reminds me of the backpacks on Space Marines, the power plants. They have that little emblem, so this guy has a little emblem as well. So yeah, be prepared. It's going to take you a little while. The third takeaway is less about the techniques that I used and more about the result. I kind of wanted it to be a little brighter. It's a little dark. It's a little grimy. I wanted something a little shinier, and I might still be able to pull that off, but not part of this project. I think that for quick painting, for getting the most bang for your hobby time buck, I guess, then the quick painting will get you 90% of where you want to go. If you want to push it up a little bit more using some more advanced techniques, then you could use this as your starting point and just embellish this model. You could add some highlights to the armor. And in fact, I'm in a good position to do that because I darkened the armor pretty well, so I can always go back and add some highlights, the same purple, maybe a little bit of white mixed in or something like that, and bring back some of that purple, but only in select spots. I could even darken up some of this purple even more in these areas where there's going to be shadows. So I could still do that if I wanted to, and in fact, I just might. I kind of want to see if I can pull it off, because those aren't techniques I'm really good at. But for now, for most of your tabletop needs, that's all she wrote. I really enjoyed building, magnetizing, and painting these guys. There's something about big stompy robots that they get me, they get me. And so I will probably end up making more big stompy robots because, well, big stompy robots. Who am I to deny myself that pleasure? But for now, that is all I have for you. I hope you learned a little bit about how to get these models to look pretty good without spending a ton of time. And I also hope that you learned that you do not need an airbrush to paint Imperial Knights. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.